March 15, 2024. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti had kept the same secret for 30 years, 300 feet from the Pope. That's exactly why Salvatore Benedetto chose this moment to surface. The peace summit at the Vatican was being broadcast to 2 billion people. Pope Francis extended his hand. Benedetto smiled, then whispered 4 words that turned Alessandro's blood to ice. "You killed my sister." The Pope pulled his hand back. Cameras captured everything. Security moved in. What happened in the next 48 hours became the Vatican's most guarded crisis. Emergency meetings were called, ancient alliances crumbled, and for the first time in centuries, a cardinal considered breaking the sacred seal of confession. The day Benedetto came for his reckoning. The day Alessandro discovered that some sins never stay buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Alessandro's hands trembled as he watched the Swiss guard escort Benedetto away from the Apostolic Palace's main hall. The Mafia boss moved with the casual confidence of a man who owned whatever room he entered, even when that room belonged to God's representative on earth. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair immaculately styled. But it was his eyes that haunted Alessandro, the same piercing gray as his sister Maria's. The cardinal pressed his back against the marble column, feeling the cold stone through his scarlet cassock. Around him, the controlled chaos of the aftermath unfolded like a choreographed dance. Vatican security spoke in hushed, urgent tones into their earpieces. Diplomatic officials clustered in small groups, their faces masks of practiced confusion. The assembled peace delegation, representatives from conflict zones across 3 continents, stood frozen in a tableau of bewilderment. But Alessandro could only see one face, Maria Benedetto, 23 years old, tears streaming down her cheeks as she knelt in the confessional booth of San Giuseppe Parish in Palermo. Her whispered words echoing across 3 decades. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. My brother, the things he makes me do for the family business, Your Eminence?" The voice cut through his memories like a blade. Monsignor Laurent Dubois, the Pope's private secretary, stood before him with the particular expression of barely controlled panic that Alessandro had learned to recognize in Vatican corridors. Laurent was 45, efficient to a fault, and had never seen anything that could shake his unflappable French composure. Until today. "His Holiness requests your immediate presence in the papal study," Laurent said, his accent thicker than usual. "The situation requires delicate handling." Alessandro nodded, not trusting his voice. As they walked through the labyrinthine corridors of the Apostolic Palace, past frescoes that had witnessed 5 centuries of secrets and scandals, he felt the weight of every step. Swiss guards stood at attention, their colorful uniforms and solemn faces a reminder that even in this sacred place, violence was never far away. The papal study occupied a corner of the 3rd floor, its windows offering a view of St. Peter's Square, where tourists continued their pilgrimages, blissfully unaware of the crisis unfolding above them. Pope Francis sat behind his simple wooden desk, his white zucchetto slightly askew, his lined face carrying the burden of leading 1.3 billion souls. "Alessandro," the Pope said without preamble, "tell me about Salvatore Benedetto." The question hit like a physical blow. Alessandro had prepared for this moment in 1,000 sleepless nights, but standing here, facing the man he'd served faithfully for 8 years, the words dissolved on his tongue. "Holy Father, The man knew your name." Pope Francis leaned forward, his dark eyes searching Alessandro's face. When security questioned him, he asked specifically for Cardinal Torretti. "He said you would understand his message." Through the tall windows, Alessandro could see news vans gathering in the square below like vultures. In the age of social media and instant global communication, the Vatican had perhaps 6 hours before this became an international incident. Every major news outlet would be scrambling to identify Benedetto, to understand why the Pope had refused what should have been a ceremonial handshake. "Your Eminence," Laurent interjected from his position by the door, "Benedetto's attorney has already contacted our offices. He's requesting a private audience." With whom? The Pope asked. Laurent's eyes flicked to Alessandro. With the cardinal. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's began to chime, marking the hour with their ancient rhythm. Alessandro had heard those bells every day for 8 years, had found comfort in their constancy. Now they sounded like a funeral dirge. "There's something else," Laurent continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Our sources in Rome police indicate that Benedetto didn't come alone. They've identified at least 6 known associates in the city. This appears to be coordinated." Pope Francis stood slowly, his arthritis evident in the careful way he moved. At 87, he had survived assassination attempts, church scandals, and global pandemics. He had stared down dictators and confronted corruption in the highest ranks of the church. But Alessandro saw something new in his eyes now. Genuine concern. "Alessandro," the Pope said, moving to the window, "in 30 years of friendship you've never lied to me. Don't start now." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Alessandro felt the weight of his red cardinal's ring, the symbol of his willingness to shed blood for the church. He had always interpreted that symbolically. Now, watching Benedetto's black sedan disappear through the Porta Sant'Anna, he wondered if the moment for literal interpretation had finally arrived. The secret that had shaped his entire career, that had driven him from a simple parish priest to the second most powerful man in the Vatican, was about to destroy everything he'd built. And somewhere in Rome, Salvatore Benedetto was waiting. Are you following along with this story? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've guessed what secret Alessandro has been hiding all these years. Subscribe now because tomorrow's chapter reveals just how far Benedetto is willing to go for his revenge. Introduction. Alessandro closed his eyes and let the silence stretch between them. When he opened them again, Pope Francis was still watching him, with those penetrating dark eyes that had comforted millions and terrified corrupt officials in equal measure. "Holy Father," Alessandro began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I need time to pray about this." It wasn't a lie, exactly. He did need time, just not for prayer. He needed to think, to remember, to prepare for a reckoning that was 30 years overdue. Pope Francis studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Of course." But Alessandro, the Pope's voice carried the gentle authority that had made him beloved worldwide. "Time is a luxury we may not have much of." As Alessandro made his way back to his private apartments in the Palazzo San Carlo, the familiar corridors of the Vatican felt different somehow. The Renaissance frescoes seemed to watch him with judging eyes, and every Swiss guard's polite nod felt like a final salute. These halls had been his sanctuary for 8 years, the culmination of a journey that began in the poverty of Naples and led him through seminary, through parishes in Sicily, through the labyrinthine politics of the Roman Curia. His apartment occupied the 3rd floor, a modest suite by Vatican standards but luxurious compared to the cramped rectory where he'd spent his early priesthood. The sitting room's tall windows faced east toward the city, and late afternoon sunlight painted everything in shades of gold and amber. His housekeeper, Signora Rossi, had left fresh flowers on the side table, white lilies that reminded him uncomfortably of funeral arrangements. Alessandro poured himself a small glass of wine from a bottle his nephew had sent from their family vineyard near Naples. The Torretti family had been making wine for 4 generations, humble farmers who saw the church as their path to respectability. His brother Giuseppe still worked the vines, his hands permanently stained with earth and grape juice, while Alessandro's hands bore only the weight of his cardinal's ring. He thought of Giuseppe's daughter, Elena, now 25 and working as a teacher in Naples. She wrote him letters every month, filled with stories of her students and questions about Vatican life that made him smile despite himself. Elena was the closest thing Alessandro had to a child of his own, and her innocent faith in his goodness was perhaps the burden he carried most heavily. What would she think when she learned the truth about her uncle? What would any of them think? The wine tasted of home, of Sunday dinners and family celebrations, of a simpler time when his biggest worry was whether his Latin homework was complete. Alessandro set the glass aside and moved to his desk, where a framed photograph showed him with Pope Francis at last year's Christmas Mass. Both men were smiling, caught in a moment of genuine joy as they celebrated the birth of Christ. How many lies had he told to reach that moment? How many omissions, half-truths, and carefully constructed silences? His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Cardinal, we should talk. The Hassler Hotel, room 507. Come alone. S.B." Alessandro stared at the screen until it went dark, his reflection ghost-like in the black glass. The Hassler was one of Rome's most exclusive hotels, perched atop the Spanish Steps like a crown jewel. It was exactly where someone like Salvatore Benedetto would stay, visible, respectable, hiding in plain sight among tourists and celebrities. Another buzz. "I have something that belonged to my sister. I think you'll want to see it." The phone slipped from Alessandro's fingers, clattering onto the marble floor. Maria. Always it came back to Maria. He remembered her laugh more clearly than her tears, bright and musical, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere of San Giuseppe Parish like sunlight through storm clouds. She had been beautiful in the way that Italian women often were, with dark eyes that held both mischief and sorrow, and black hair that she wore long despite her brother's conservative expectations. Maria had come to confession 3 times before she finally told him the truth. The first 2 times, she'd confessed minor sins, vanity, small lies to her mother, impure thoughts about a boy from the university, standard sins for a young woman trying to live a good life in a complicated world. The 3rd time, she'd wept. Alessandro rose from his chair and walked to the window. Below, Rome stretched out in all its eternal glory, a city that had seen emperors and popes, saints and sinners, all of them convinced that their secrets would die with them. But secrets never died. They just waited, like seeds in winter soil, for the right conditions to sprout. His reflection in the window glass showed a man who looked older than his 61 years. Silver hair carefully styled, the purple of his cardinal's cassock a stark reminder of his position. He had built this life deliberately, each promotion and appointment a step further from that young priest in Sicily who had made a choice that damned them both. Somewhere in the city below, Salvatore Benedetto was waiting with evidence of that choice, and tomorrow, Alessandro would have to decide whether to confess or fight, whether to protect the church or save his soul. The bells of St. Peter's chimed again, marking another hour closer to judgment. The 3rd chime had barely faded when Alessandro's phone rang, its sharp trill shattering the contemplative silence of his apartment. He stared at the device on the marble floor where it had fallen, watching the unknown number flash across the cracked screen. His hands remained frozen at his sides as the sound echoed off the frescoed walls. On the 5th ring, he bent to retrieve it. "Cardinal Torretti." His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Alessandro." The voice carried the unmistakable cadence of Sicily, vowels that lingered like smoke, consonants sharp as broken glass. 30 years had deepened Salvatore's voice, but Alessandro would have recognized it in his dreams. "You sound older. What do you want, Salvatore?" A low chuckle, still direct. "I always appreciated that about you, even when it killed my sister." The words hit like a physical blow. Alessandro gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Through his windows, Rome continued its eternal dance. Tourists photographing fountains, lovers walking hand in hand, children chasing pigeons in the piazzas. None of them knew that in a quiet apartment in the Vatican, a man's world was crumbling with each syllable. "She confessed to you," Salvatore continued, his voice taking on a tone that Alessandro remembered from their youth, dangerously calm. "3 times she went to your little church. 3 times she knelt in that box and poured out her soul to the young priest who promised her God's forgiveness. The seal of confession. Don't." The word cracked like a whip. "Don't hide behind your church law. Not with me. Not about this." Alessandro closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 28 again, standing in the cramped sacristy of San Giuseppe Parish after evening mass. The scent of incense still hung in the air, mixing with the smell of candle wax and old wood. Father Carmine Russo had been waiting for him, his mentor's face grave with concern. "The Benedetto girl has told you something," Carmine had said. It wasn't a question. "Father, I cannot—" "Alessandro." Carmine's voice had been gentle but firm. There are things larger than individual souls. The church must survive. The community must be protected. Sometimes a priest must choose between one life and many. You're remembering, Salvatore said now, as if he could see through the phone line into Alessandro's tortured thoughts. Good. I want you to remember everything when you see what I've brought you. I don't know what you think you have, but… Letters, Alessandro, in Maria's handwriting. Letters she never sent, hidden in a jewelry box that survived the fire that took our family home. Letters where she names the priest who convinced her to trust him, the priest who promised her sanctuary if she would only tell the truth about her brother's business. The phone nearly slipped from Alessandro's trembling fingers again. He had never known about letters. In 30 years of guilt and sleepless nights, he had convinced himself that Maria's confession died with her, that only 3 people knew the truth of what happened in that booth: Maria, himself, and God. He had been wrong. Told Carmine Russo everything she said, Salvatore continued relentlessly. Every detail about our operations, our contacts, our vulnerabilities. And Carmine, that pious old bastard, he passed it along to his friends in the Carabinieri. They used my sister's confession to plan the raid that went wrong, the raid that got her killed. Alessandro sank into his chair, the weight of 30 years crashing down on him. Through his window, the dome of St. Peter's dominated the skyline, that magnificent testament to faith and human ambition. He had spent decades convincing himself that what he'd done was for the greater good, that one young woman's life weighed against the safety of an entire community was a necessary sacrifice. Now, hearing Salvatore's voice, remembering Maria's tears, the justifications crumbled like ancient parchment. The beautiful part, Salvatore said, his voice now soft with malice, is that Carmine Russo is still alive, still pulling strings, still convinced that he can sacrifice anyone for his vision of the greater good. And now he's your mentor in the Vatican hierarchy, isn't he, Alessandro? The man who taught you that some secrets are worth killing for? The revelation hit Alessandro like lightning. Cardinal Carmine Russo, now 84 and serving as Camerlengo, had been his guide through every promotion, every appointment that brought him closer to power. The man who had shaped his understanding of duty and sacrifice. The man who had orchestrated Maria's death and Alessandro's rise in equal measure. Room 507, Salvatore said. 1 hour. Come alone, or I call the newspapers. Your choice, Cardinal. The line went dead, leaving Alessandro staring at his reflection in the dark phone screen. In the space of a single conversation, his carefully constructed world had shattered completely. There would be no going back to the comfortable certainties of yesterday, no return to the illusion that his sins were buried with the dead. Somewhere in the Hassler Hotel, Salvatore Benedetto waited with evidence that could destroy not just Alessandro, but the entire network of power that had built itself on Maria's grave. The bells of St. Peter's chimed again, but this time they sounded like a death knell. Early development. Alessandro stood motionless in his apartment for 20 minutes after the call ended, watching the shadows lengthen across the marble floor. The rational part of his mind, the part that had navigated Vatican politics for 30 years, whispered that he should call security, inform the Pope, let the institutional machinery of the Church handle this threat. Instead, he found himself changing into civilian clothes. The simple act of removing his cardinal's cassock felt like shedding his skin. Without the purple silk, without the weight of his pectoral cross, he was just Alessandro Torretti from Naples, a frightened man in a borrowed life. He pulled on dark trousers and a black coat, clothes that would let him disappear into Rome's crowded streets. His hands shook as he reached for his phone to call Cardinal Russo. The old man answered on the second ring, his voice as sharp as ever despite his 84 years. Alessandro, I was expecting your call. The words sent ice through Alessandro's veins. You know? I know that Benedetto has surfaced. I know he made contact. Russo's breathing was labored, the sound of a man whose body was failing but whose mind remained ruthlessly clear. What I need to know is whether you're going to be foolish enough to meet with him. Alessandro closed his eyes. Even now, 3 decades later, Carmine Russo could read him like scripture. He has evidence, letters. Maria Benedetto was a romantic girl who wrote poetry and kept a diary. She romanticized everything, including her conversations with a young priest who showed her kindness. Russo's voice carried the patient tone he'd always used when explaining unpleasant realities. Whatever she wrote down was the fantasy of a troubled young woman, nothing more. And if it's not, if she documented everything? The silence stretched long enough that Alessandro wondered if the old man had hung up. When Russo finally spoke, his voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Then you will remember why we made those choices in the first place. The Benedetto family was poisoning that community, Alessandro. Drugs flowing through that parish, children dying in the streets. Maria came to you because God gave you an opportunity to end it, by betraying the seal of confession. By serving the greater good. Russo's breathing grew more ragged. You were always too sentimental, my boy. That's why you needed guidance. That's why every decision since then has been filtered through this office. The revelation hit Alessandro like a physical blow. You've been controlling my career? All of it? Protecting it. Protecting you. Protecting the church from the consequences of necessary decisions. Russo coughed, a wet sound that spoke of failing lungs. Do you think your appointment as Secretary of State was coincidence? Do you think the Holy Father chose you from among hundreds of qualified cardinals because of your administrative skills? Alessandro sank into his chair as the scope of the manipulation became clear. Every promotion, every transfer, every opportunity that had lifted him from a small Sicilian parish to the heights of Vatican power. All of it orchestrated by the man who had taught him that some sins were worth committing. Where are you now? Russo asked. My apartment. Stay there. I'm sending someone. No. The word surprised Alessandro with its firmness. I'm going to meet him. Alessandro, this ends tonight, one way or another. He hung up before Russo could respond, then immediately turned off the phone. For the first time in 30 years, he was cutting himself off from the network that had sustained and controlled his rise. The walk to the Hassler Hotel took 40 minutes through Rome's winding streets. Alessandro kept to the crowds, moving with the evening flow of tourists and locals, past the Pantheon, where ancient gods still seemed to whisper from weathered stones, past the Trevi Fountain, where thousands tossed coins and wished for impossible things. He thought about prayer as he walked, about the simple faith that had driven him to seminary 4 decades ago. When had that faith become contaminated with ambition? When had serving God become indistinguishable from serving power? The Spanish steps rose before him like a marble waterfall frozen in time. The Hassler perched at their summit, its belly-puck facade glowing in the evening light. Alessandro had attended diplomatic receptions here, had blessed foreign dignitaries in the hotel's ornate ballroom. Now he was approaching it like a condemned man walking to execution. The lobby's opulent splendor, crystal chandeliers, marble floors, fresh flowers arranged with museum-quality precision, felt like a mockery. He gave Salvatore's room number to the desk clerk, who directed him to the elevators with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to facilitating secret meetings. The 5th-floor corridor stretched before him, silent except for the whisper of expensive carpeting beneath his feet. Room 507 stood at the far end, its door identical to all the others except for the weight of consequence that seemed to emanate from behind it. Alessandro raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Once he crossed this threshold, there would be no returning to the careful fiction of his innocence. From inside the room came the sound of movement, and then Salvatore Benedetto's voice, speaking as if he'd been watching through the peephole. Come in, Cardinal. It's time you saw what your faith has cost. The door opened before Alessandro could knock. Salvatore Benedetto stood in the doorway, and 30 years collapsed into a single heartbeat. The boy Alessandro remembered had possessed his sister's dark eyes and quick smile, but the man before him carried violence in every line of his body. His face bore the map of a hard life, scars along his jaw, eyes that had seen too much, hands that had done what was necessary to survive. You look exactly like a cardinal should, Salvatore said, stepping aside, distinguished, moral, trustworthy. Alessandro entered the suite, his eyes immediately drawn to the sitting area where a small wooden box sat open on the coffee table. Even from across the room, he could see the yellowed edges of paper, the faded ink of handwriting he had tried to forget. Close the door, Alessandro. The sound of the lock engaging seemed to echo through the opulent space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Rome at twilight, the eternal city spreading out below them like a glittering promise of redemption that neither man would ever claim. Drink? Salvatore moved to a bar cart, his movements controlled but predatory. I have excellent whiskey. Irish. I thought about getting something Italian, but I've developed a taste for things that bite back. I don't. You'll want the drink. Salvatore poured 2 glasses without waiting for an answer, the amber liquid catching the last rays of sunlight. He handed one to Alessandro, then settled into the chair across from the coffee table, his eyes never leaving the cardinal's face. She wrote about you every day after the first confession, Salvatore said, nodding toward the box. Called you Father Angel. Said you listened to her like she mattered, like her soul was worth saving instead of something to be bartered for information. Alessandro's hand trembled as he raised the glass to his lips. The whiskey burned, but not as much as the memory of Maria's face the last time he saw her, radiant with hope, believing that her honesty had purchased her family's salvation. Read one, Salvatore commanded, gesturing to the letters. Pick any one. Salvatore, Read it. Alessandro set down his drink and approached the box like a man approaching his own coffin. The letters were tied with a faded blue ribbon, dozens of pages covered in Maria's careful script. His fingers found one at random, and the paper felt fragile enough to crumble at his touch. Dear Father Angel, he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. I told you everything today, just like you said, about Salvatore's business, about the men who come to the house, about the money hidden in Mama's garden. You promised me that God would protect our family if I was brave enough to tell the truth. I believe you. You have kind eyes, and when you blessed me, I felt clean for the first time in months. Tomorrow I will convince Salvatore to stop the bad things. I will tell him that God has shown us a better way through you. The letter slipped from Alessandro's fingers, floating to the floor like a dying bird. In the growing darkness outside, Rome's lights began to twinkle, each one a small prayer offered up to an indifferent sky. She was going to warn me, Salvatore said quietly. My own sister, trying to save my soul by destroying my life. If the Carabinieri raid hadn't happened first, she would have come to me with your promises of protection. She would have died anyway, just more slowly. Alessandro sank onto the sofa, his legs no longer capable of supporting him. I believed we could save everyone. You believed what Carmine Russo told you to believe. Salvatore leaned forward, his voice hardening. That old bastard played you like a violin, convinced you that betraying a sacred trust was God's work. And when the bullets started flying, when my sister died in a warehouse because she thought angels were watching over her, where was your protection then? The room seemed to spin around Alessandro. Everything he had built his life upon, his faith, his position, his carefully constructed justifications, was crumbling with each word. How do you know about Cardinal Russo's involvement? Salvatore's smile was sharp as broken glass. Because he's been watching you ever since. Every promotion, every assignment, every time your conscience started to trouble you too much. Did you really think it was coincidence that your biggest career advances always came right after you'd started, asking uncomfortable questions about that night in Sicily? Alessandro closed his eyes, but the truth was inescapable now. 30 years of manipulation, of being guided and controlled by the very man who had orchestrated Maria's death. What do you want from me? I want you to remember what faith actually cost, Salvatore said, gathering the letters back into their box. Because tomorrow, when I present these to the press, I want you to understand that every word of destruction is written in my sister's blood. And Cardinal Russo? He's going to learn that some sins eventually demand payment. The whiskey glass slipped from Alessandro's nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor like the last of his illusions. The sound of breaking glass seemed to reverberate through the suite for an eternity. Alessandro stared at the scattered shards, each fragment reflecting the room's lamplight like fallen stars, and suddenly he was seeing everything differently. Every memory shifted into focus with brutal clarity. Cardinal Russo's midnight visits to his apartment when Alessandro's guilt became too heavy to bear. The sudden transfer from Sicily after he'd begun asking questions about the raid. The promotion to the Vatican, when whispers about his past had started circulating among local clergy. Each intervention he'd attributed to divine providence or his mentor's paternal care now revealed itself as calculated damage control. "You're starting to understand," Salvatore observed, watching Alessandro's face with predatory satisfaction. "I can see it happening, the beautiful moment when all the lies stop working." Alessandro's voice came out as a broken whisper. "He's been protecting himself, not me." Finally, Salvatore leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey. "Carmine Russo needed you quiet and controlled because you were the only witness to his methods. Every time you rose in the church hierarchy, you became more valuable to him, and more dangerous if you ever decided to develop a conscience." The hotel room felt like it was closing in around them. Through the windows, Rome sparkled with deceptive beauty. The same city where popes had once sold indulgences and cardinals had poisoned their rivals. History repeating itself in endless variations of corruption and betrayal. "The Peace Summit," Alessandro said suddenly, pieces clicking into place. "Your appearance there, it wasn't random. You knew I'd recognize you. I've been planning this moment for 30 years. Salvatore's smile held no warmth. "Building my reputation, gathering intelligence, waiting for the perfect opportunity to destroy both of you. When I learned about the Vatican's involvement in the summit, when I saw your name listed as the Pope's chief advisor," he gestured to the letterbox. "Maria's letters gave me everything I needed to understand how Russo operates. Always through intermediaries, always with plausible deniability, always convinced of his own righteousness." Alessandro stood abruptly, pacing to the window. His reflection stared back at him, a man in expensive clothes whose face bore the weight of 3 decades worth of carefully buried guilt. "What did the letters tell you?" "That my sister wasn't just giving information in confession. She was receiving instructions." Salvatore's voice dropped to a deadly quiet. "Russo had you coaching her, Alessandro, teaching her what questions to ask her brother, what details to remember, how to gradually extract information that would seem natural coming from a worried sister." The revelation hit Alessandro like a physical blow. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, remembering now how he'd guided Maria's confessions, suggesting topics that had seemed pastorally relevant at the time. The specific questions about her family's activities that Cardinal Russo had taught him to weave into their conversations. "She thought she was earning redemption," Alessandro whispered, "but she was being recruited by a priest she trusted, a priest who convinced her that betraying her family was an act of love." Salvatore stood, moving to join Alessandro at the window. "Tell me, Cardinal, in all your years of advancement, did Russo ever ask you to do anything like that again? Guide confessions for information?" Alessandro's blood turned to ice. "No, never. Of course not. He learned from that mistake. Too messy, too much direct involvement. Better to work through existing intelligence networks, diplomatic channels, financial pressure. Much cleaner." Salvatore's reflection appeared beside Alessandro's in the glass. "You were his prototype, Alessandro. His proof of concept that a priest's authority could be weaponized. After Maria died, he refined his methods." "You're lying." But even as Alessandro said it, he knew it was true. The sudden expansion of Vatican intelligence capabilities during Russo's tenure, the mysterious funding for new diplomatic initiatives, the carefully orchestrated relationships with law enforcement agencies across Europe. "Am I?" Salvatore reached into his jacket and withdrew a smartphone. He scrolled through what looked like financial records, bank transfers, encrypted communications. 30 years of building networks, Alessandro. 30 years of using the church's moral authority to gather intelligence that Russo sells to the highest bidder. Intelligence that gets people killed, just like my sister. Alessandro turned away from the window, unable to bear his own reflection anymore. "How do you have access to those records?" "Because some of the people Russo destroyed over the years had friends who remembered. Friends who spent decades gathering evidence, waiting for someone with the right motivation to use it." Salvatore pocketed the phone. "I'm not the only person who wants to see that old man burn, Cardinal. I'm just the one with the best reason." The implications crashed over Alessandro like a tsunami. Not just his own corruption, but an entire system built on Maria's grave. Russo's network had grown from a single betrayed confession into something vast and terrible. "He made me into this," Alessandro said, the words emerging like a prayer offered to an empty sky. "No," Salvatore replied, his voice cutting through every excuse Alessandro had ever constructed. "You chose to believe his lies because they were easier than living with the truth." The accusation hung in the air like incense at a funeral mass. Alessandro felt something fundamental shift inside him, a tectonic movement of the soul that had been building for 30 years. The careful architecture of justification that had supported his rise through Vatican hierarchy was finally collapsing under its own weight. "You're right," he said, the words emerging with surprising clarity. "I chose the comfortable lie over the hard truth, but that choice ends tonight." Salvatore's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Pretty words from a man who's built his life on betrayal. Not pretty words. A promise. Alessandro turned from the window, facing the man whose sister's blood had paved his path to power. "Russo controls me through fear of exposure, but what if I expose myself first? What if I tell the truth before you can destroy me with it?" "The truth?" Salvatore's laugh was bitter as communion wine. "You don't even know what truth is anymore. You've been Russo's puppet so long you've forgotten how to think without his strings." Alessandro moved to the coffee table, kneeling beside the scattered glass from his dropped whiskey. As he carefully gathered the sharp fragments, he felt each piece cut into his palm, small wounds that somehow seemed proportionate to the larger damage he had inflicted on the world. "Maria wrote about wanting to make a proper confession," he said, holding up one of the bloodied shards. "The last letter I read, she mentioned wanting to tell me about her own sins, not just report on her family's activities. I never gave her that chance. Because Russo needed information, not absolution. Because I was too much of a coward to recognize the difference." Alessandro let the glass fragment fall to the floor. "She came to me seeking God's forgiveness, and I turned her into an informant. Then I convinced myself I was saving souls when I was really just collecting intelligence for a man who saw the confessional as another kind of surveillance network." Salvatore remained silent, but Alessandro could sense something shifting in the room's atmosphere. The predatory tension was evolving into something more complex, more uncertain. "Tomorrow morning, Pope Francis addresses the Peace Summit," Alessandro continued, rising to his feet. 1,500 delegates from across Europe, including law enforcement officials, politicians, and yes, representatives from various criminal organizations who have expressed interest in negotiated settlements with authorities. "I know the schedule, Cardinal." "Then you know that Cardinal Russo will be there, advising the Holy Father on the delicate balance between justice and mercy." Alessandro's voice grew stronger with each word. "You plan to present those letters publicly, to expose our betrayal of your sister in front of the international media." The thought had occurred to me. "It's a good plan, devastating for both of us, and ultimately satisfying for you." Alessandro reached into his jacket and withdrew his own phone. "But what if I offered you something better?" Salvatore's posture shifted, the careful stillness of a predator recognizing unexpected movement from its prey. "Such as?" "Access to Russo's entire network. Real access, not just the financial records you've managed to piece together." Alessandro held up his phone. "I've been his most trusted protege for 3 decades. I have passwords, account numbers, communication protocols. I can give you everything, every contact, every operation, every crime committed under the guise of church business." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither man was certain they could cross. Outside their window, Rome's ancient bells began marking the hour, their bronze voices calling across the darkness with the same notes that had summoned prayers and proclaimed victories for 2,000 years. "Why?" Salvatore finally asked. "Why would you destroy yourself to help me?" "Because I'm already destroyed. Have been since the night your sister died, believing I would protect her." Alessandro showed Salvatore his bleeding palm. "This is what I've been doing for 30 years, handling sharp truths badly, cutting myself and everyone around me while pretending the wounds don't exist." Salvatore moved closer, his dark eyes searching Alessandro's face for deception. "You're talking about ending your career, your position, your entire life's work." "My life's work died in a warehouse in Sicily 30 years ago." Alessandro's voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. "Everything since then has just been an elaborate form of penance that helped no one and saved nothing. Maybe it's time to try actual redemption instead. Russo will know you've betrayed him the moment anything starts happening to his network." "Yes, which means we'll have to move quickly." Alessandro pulled up his contacts list, hovering over Cardinal Russo's number. "He's expecting me to remain quietly terrified, manipulable. He's not prepared for someone who's finally ready to burn it all down." Salvatore studied him for a long moment, then slowly reached for his own phone. "There are people who will want to move on this intelligence immediately. Tonight, if possible. Then we'd better make our calls." As they began dialing their respective numbers, Alessandro felt something he hadn't experienced since his ordination 40 years ago, the terrible, liberating sensation of choosing faith over fear. Cardinal Russo answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a man accustomed to late-night calls about church business. "Alessandro, I was expecting to hear from you. The peace summit preparations are proceeding smoothly, I trust?" "Very smoothly, Your Eminence." Alessandro kept his voice steady while watching Salvatore murmur rapid instructions in Sicilian dialect to someone on the other end of his own call. "I'm calling about our discussion regarding potential security concerns." "Ah, yes, the Benedetto matter. Has our troublesome guest become more reasonable?" Alessandro closed his eyes, hearing 30 years of manipulation distilled into those casual words, "our troublesome guest." As if Salvatore were merely an inconvenient appointment, rather than the brother of a woman Russo had orchestrated into her grave. "Actually, Your Eminence, Mr. Benedetto has provided some fascinating insights into historical church operations in Sicily. I think you'd find his perspective quite illuminating." The pause on the other end stretched just long enough for Alessandro to understand that Cardinal Russo's political instincts were finally registering danger. Historical perspectives can be so unreliable, Alessandro, often colored by personal grievances and incomplete information, indeed. Which is why I thought you might want to review the primary source documents he shared with me. Letters, financial records, communication transcripts, remarkably complete documentation of pastoral activities from the 1990s. Another pause, longer this time. Alessandro could practically hear the machinery of Russo's mind calculating odds, assessing threats, preparing defensive strategies. "I see. And where are these documents now?" "Safe, very safe." Alessandro met Salvatore's eyes as the other man concluded his own phone conversation with a sharp nod. "I thought perhaps we could discuss them tomorrow morning, before the Holy Father's address. A private conversation about historical accuracy and pastoral accountability." Alessandro Russo's voice dropped to the paternal tone that had guided Alessandro's career for 3 decades, the same warmth that had convinced a young priest that betraying the confessional was an act of holy service. "I hope you understand the gravity of whatever game you think you're playing. Your position, your future, your very place in the church. All of these depend on wisdom rather than sentiment." The threat was elegantly delivered, wrapped in concern and seasoned with just enough affection to remind Alessandro of everything he stood to lose. For 30 years, that tone had been enough to ensure his compliance, his silence, his willing participation in Russo's expanding network of influence and control. "I understand perfectly, Your Eminence, perhaps more perfectly than ever before." Alessandro's hand had stopped bleeding, but the cuts across his palm served as a tangible reminder of what choosing sharp truths actually cost. "Which is why I think tomorrow's conversation will be so illuminating for both of us." He ended the call before Russo could respond, cutting off the voice that had shaped his adult life with the decisive motion of a man finally ready to stop listening to comfortable lies. Salvatore was watching him with something that might have been grudging respect. "He knows." Yes, he knows. Alessandro felt strangely calm, the terrible peace that comes when all bridges have been burned, and the only direction remaining is forward. "How long do we have?" "My contacts are already moving on the financial networks." bank accounts, communication channels, operational assets. Everything will start unraveling within hours. Salvatore slipped his phone back into his jacket. But the most important action happens tomorrow morning, in front of 1,500 witnesses and international media. Alessandro nodded, understanding. When Cardinal Russo advises the Pope during the peace summit, when he's positioned as the Church's moral authority on questions of justice and reconciliation, that's when the documents become public. That's when the world sees what Vatican justice actually looks like. What happens when the Church's confessional authority is weaponized against the faithful? Salvatore's voice carried 30 years of controlled fury finally finding its target. Your precious mentor will stand beside the Holy Father, speaking about mercy and redemption, while every news outlet in Europe broadcasts the evidence of what he really is. The magnitude of what they had set in motion settled over Alessandro like a shroud, not just his own career, but the entire structure that had elevated Cardinal Russo to power. The intelligence networks, the financial channels, the carefully cultivated relationships between the Vatican and law enforcement agencies across the continent. All of it built on Maria Benedetto's betrayed trust and maintained through Alessandro's terrified complicity. "He'll try to sacrifice me," Alessandro said quietly. "Claim I was a rogue operative, that he knew nothing about the specific methods used in Sicily." Salvatore's smile was sharp as altar wine. "Let him try. I have 30 years of evidence that says otherwise. Bank transfers with his authorization codes, communication records with his encrypted signatures, operational documents bearing his personal seal." He gestured toward the box of Maria's letters. "Your sister's confession wasn't an isolated incident, Cardinal. It was the beginning of something much larger and more terrible." Thunder rumbled across Rome's 7 hills, and through the hotel windows, Alessandro could see lightning illuminating the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Tomorrow, in that same building, the careful architecture of lies would finally collapse under the weight of long-delayed truth. The storm broke over Rome with biblical fury, sheets of rain hammering the ancient cobblestones while lightning transformed St. Peter's dome into a beacon against the roiling sky. Alessandro stood at the hotel window, watching the tempest rage across the eternal city, and felt an unexpected calm settle over him like absolution. By morning, 30 years of carefully constructed lies would lie in ruins. His career, his position, his entire identity within the church hierarchy, all of it would be swept away by the same truth he had spent 3 decades running from. Yet for the first time since his ordination, he felt genuinely at peace. Behind him, Salvatore was methodically packing Maria's letters back into their worn wooden box, handling each page with the reverence of a man gathering relics. The careful precision of his movements spoke to years of patient preparation, decades of waiting for this moment when justice could finally be served. "She would have been 58 next month," Salvatore said quietly, not looking up from his task. Maria always loved thunderstorms, used to say they were God's way of washing the world clean. Alessandro turned from the window, studying the face of the man who had become both his nemesis and, strangely, his salvation. "What will you do afterward, when this is finished?" "I haven't thought that far ahead. For 30 years, bringing down the people who killed my sister has been my only purpose." Salvatore sealed the box with deliberate care. "Perhaps I'll learn how to live with something other than rage." The honesty in those words cut deeper than any accusation. Alessandro recognized the hollow echo of a life shaped entirely by pursuit of a single goal, the spiritual emptiness that comes from defining oneself through opposition rather than purpose. He had lived that same existence, climbing the church hierarchy not from love of service, but from desperate need to justify Maria's death, to convince himself that his betrayal had served some greater good. "I should have protected her," Alessandro said, the words emerging without conscious decision. "When she came to me seeking forgiveness, I should have given her sanctuary, not turned her into an intelligence asset." "Yes, you should have." Salvatore's response carried no malice, only the stark weight of acknowledged truth. "But you were young, ambitious, and completely under Russo's influence. He chose you carefully, a priest hungry enough for advancement to compromise his vows, but still idealistic enough to believe his own justifications. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, the thunder moving east toward the Mediterranean, while rain continued to drum against the windows in a gentler rhythm. Alessandro found himself thinking of Sicily, of the parish where his adult life had truly begun, where an old priest had taught him that the confessional was sacred precisely because it offered unconditional sanctuary to broken souls seeking redemption. Cardinal Russo will claim he was trying to infiltrate criminal organizations to save lives, Alessandro said. He'll present himself as a misunderstood hero who made difficult choices in service of the greater good. Perhaps, but the evidence suggests something rather different. Salvatore stood, cradling the box of letters against his chest, a pattern of exploitation that began with my sister and expanded into a sophisticated network of intelligence gathering, money laundering, and political manipulation, all hidden behind the church's moral authority. Alessandro nodded, remembering fragments of conversations over the years, hints of operations and relationships that he had trained himself not to examine too closely, the willful blindness of a man who feared what clarity might cost him. There will be investigations, trials. Everything we've done will be dissected by prosecutors and journalists. He met Salvatore's dark eyes. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Having every detail of your own life examined, questioned, potentially criminalized? I've been preparing for exactly that for 30 years. Salvatore moved toward the door, then paused. Are you? The question hung in the air like incense, rich with implications and weighted with the gravity of irrevocable choice. Alessandro thought of his apartment near the Vatican, filled with books on theology and church history, photographs with powerful men, awards and honors that would soon become artifacts of disgrace. He thought of his elderly mother in Milan, who still lit candles for her son, the cardinal, proud of his ascension to the highest levels of church authority. No, he admitted, I'm not prepared for any of this. But I'm finally ready to face it. Salvatore studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. After 30 years of separation, guilt, and mutual destruction, the gesture seemed impossibly simple. Alessandro grasped it firmly, feeling the calluses of a working man's palm against his own soft fingers. For just an instant, he imagined he could sense Maria's presence in the room, not as the frightened young woman he had failed, but as the agent of grace that had finally brought truth into the light. When morning came, the storm would be over, and the real reckoning would begin.